Well, I mean, clearly the overseas markets are a very big driver for a lot of the Chinese auto companies. I think we're very aware domestically the competition in China is so fierce that there is a big push to look for new markets. Generally speaking, for these Chinese players, it's more receptive areas, like you mentioned, possibly ASEAN or LATAM, but more increasingly, as we see with the Munich Auto Show, into Europe as well. And I think that's going to be a trend that will continue over the next couple of years.
We are also, of course, tracking other new locations like Mexico, and recently they are looking to introduce tariffs to Chinese automakers to the amount of 25%. What does this do to automakers like BYD, who had earlier pledged a $3 billion plant there?
I think the tariff issue is something which the Chinese automakers are very closely watching. They generally don't like to make big decisions, especially about local production, without some clarity on where the tariff picture is going to lie. Now, if that tariff comes through in Mexico, I think there could be another push to look for localization. We will see. I think that's a little bit too early to say. But I would say overall, the thing that's very important about Chinese autos is that where they're taking market share a lot of times, it's not really from the Western brands, it's really from the other Asian brands. And I think that's what we've seen in Mexico. So from that perspective, the value proposition of a lot of these Chinese cars, I think remains intact even with some of these tariffs.
Now, in terms of the moves over in Mexico, whether or not it imposes tariffs, it of course has a fine balancing act, whether or not it will accept billion-dollar of investments or to keep and stay on the right side with a very important neighbor.
It's a very difficult question to answer. I would say this: when the Chinese automakers, BYD, Great Wall, et cetera, look at the overseas markets, when they look at Mexico, which is part of North America, but broadly speaking also LATAM, they look at it as a broader whole market. I mean, Mexico is one market, but they've done very well in Brazil. BYD, for example, I think is moving to Argentina recently. So they're looking at other opportunities in the region as well. I think they'll try to just diversify their bets a bit rather than just focus on one country.
In terms of the IAA Mobility Conference, is there anything that's going on there that stuck out to you?
I think clearly the big push and the wide availability of different cars from the Chinese makers is very interesting. But one thing I think is a bit nuanced here is when people talk about the share gains in Europe this year, I think Chinese automakers for the first half is about 5% share. But it's not really taking share from the domestic players in Europe. If you look at the Japanese and Korean players in Europe, I think last year they're about 17%. This year there's about 15% for the first half, whereas Chinese players gained about 2%. So you can almost say it looks like a direct kind of swap out from different Asian automakers into the Chinese automakers. But overall, the pie is about the same, which is quite interesting. So I think that's one dynamic that sticks out to me that I think people are still trying to figure out in Europe right now.
Did you get caught off guard by BYD and its its assessment of full year sales deliveries? It had lowered its estimate by about 16% to 4.4 million. Even with the push for growth offshore, they still had to revise downwards their full year target.
Yeah, it's a very tricky question. I would say this. I think very recently they've also mentioned that their overseas sales, I think for the second half of the year, they think could double. So overall, that's roughly maybe 1 million units for 2025. So if you take that off of the supposed new guidance, it looks like the domestic market for them is very weak. And that comes down, in my opinion, really to the competition that we're seeing in China this year. It's exceptionally fierce. I would argue that over the last couple of years, in the Chinese automaker, there are still a couple blue oceans, some areas where you can build a new model and get a lot of demand. I feel like this year, there are no more blue oceans. Every single category, there's at least one or two pretty strong competitors, and BYD has to deal with that now.
Now, as we were listening to He Xiaopeng earlier talking about his expansion plans, he said something that triggered my memory, and I had spoken to him earlier on in the year in June, where he says that they're planning to expand into 60 countries and regions by the end of this year. How are they doing so far? I mean, we only have a couple more months out to the end of this year. Are they being a little bit too optimistic?
I think the expansion part is something which they can achieve because it's really about just setting up the dealership networks in very specific countries. And I think that's something which they can reach. It's the volumes that I think is the question mark. How much of their volume can they really sell overseas? I think Arjun just asked the question about the tariffs. And, you know, Xiaopeng doesn't really seem that concerned. But I think the reason why is because right now the volumes are relatively low. Now, assuming they can grow much faster, then the tariffs will bite much harder. And I think they'll try to look for a way to manage around that.